Welcome to session 9 of our class on the conquest through the divided kingdom. We have come to the book of Ruth. Ruth is the major character of the book that bears her name. The book takes place in the time of the judges. As we noted earlier, the time of the judges lasted from about 300 to 350 years. And that is a long time of apostasy and rebellion to the will of God, with a few intervals of faithfulness. And this leads us to the question of the purpose and message of Ruth. Given the constant rebellion and unfaithfulness in the book of Judges, one might get the idea that since very few remain faithful to God, then the covenant concerning Abraham's descendants and the blessing that would come through them might be compromised. The book of Ruth offers a message about how the faith of some survived throughout this time of rebellion. That is why it ends with the genealogy of David. The message is that God preserved the faithful families, and David's family was one of them. Two of the most beautiful and most important passages in the book are Ruth 1 and verse 16 and Ruth 4 and verse 17. In Ruth 1:16 it says, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." And then in chapter 4 and verse 17, it says, "The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David." Now, the book of Ruth contains one of the most delightful stories in the Bible. I say story, I've said that before. What I want to say is account. It's not something that's made up, it's true. In it, we see things working out right for all the main characters. And the reader finishes the story with a satisfied feeling that all is well. Things really do work together for good to those who love God, as Paul was to write many years later in Romans 8 and verse 28. The book of Ruth tells us that the period of the Judges was not characterized totally by chaos, that God was still in control, that human virtues such as kindness and loyalty still had a place in Israel, and that an ideal king was about to be raised up. As we have said, the book provides a refreshing contrast to the incessantly negative message about conditions in Israel during the time of the Judges. It tells a simple yet profound and carefully constructed account about one family's fortunes during a difficult time, and of God's subtle but sure and steady involvement in blessing their lives. Again, as we have said, the book's title comes from its main character, Ruth. She was a Moabite woman who was a godly, loyal daughter-in-law to Naomi. Naomi was a woman from Judah who lost her husband and two sons while living in Moab. And they had went to Moab because there was a famine in Judah. Ruth is a good example of a foreigner who came to embrace Israel's God through contact with Israelites. She indeed blessed Abraham's descendants, and she was blessed through them. Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3 talks about that. She was an ancestor of David and one of four women, all foreigners, in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. Her name is not known elsewhere in the Old Testament, and its meaning and national origin are uncertain. It appears to mean refreshment, satiation, comfort. which certainly would fit her character and the character of the book. However, the book does not make a point of this. Now, the book's author is unknown. The suggestion has been made by several that the author was a woman, since the two main characters were women, and they are presented as acting assertively throughout. The author was a consummate crafter of writing these things down. The account is rightly lauded far and wide as a literary masterpiece. The Jewish Talmud attributed the book to Samuel as an author, but scholars today date it later than that. Discussions of the book's date often hinge on what the book's purpose was. A reasonable consensus exists today that the book was written sometime during the early kingdoms, during the early monarchy, perhaps during the reign of Solomon, or maybe earlier in David's reign. I personally see no problem with Samuel having written it. The purpose of the book, when we consider that, while the book clearly is satisfying to read, the primary reason for its having been written is not clearly stated. And this has led to many proposals concerning its purpose. Some believe that the book was written simply to entertain or to tell a pleasing story about friendship. However, on the latter point, we should note that the story emphasizes family relationships more than it does friendship. On the former point, while affirming its value for beauty as an account, most would go beyond that as a primary purpose for the book. That is, it's not simply just to entertain. As we've said before, perhaps the best heading under which to see the book's purpose has to do with God's activity, with God as the controlling agent behind the events of the book. This fits well with various statements within the book, and it allows for the inclusion of and accounting for the Davidic genealogy, since by God's providence, Ruth and Boaz are included into the royal line that God had been providentially overseeing since the days of the patriarchs. Now, there's no real question concerning the dating of the events in the book of Ruth. They occurred during the period of the Judges, according to chapter 1 and verse 1. Now, exactly when they occurred within that period is uncertain. It may have been relatively late in the period of the Judges, as Boaz is presented as David's grandfather. However, the genealogy may have been somewhat flexible, and Boaz may have been somewhat further removed from David than the genealogy implies. Just because a genealogy in Scripture gives names, as in so-and-so was the father of, so-and-so was the father of, and so forth, doesn't mean that every single person is listed. Okay? Could be that the word father simply means ancestor in those cases. Now, questions of historical background for the book, then, are essentially the same as those for the book of Judges. What we want to do, then, at this point is briefly consider the Moabites, since Ruth was a Moabite, and the customs of what is called levirate marriage and redemption found in the book. Now, we'll define that term levirate here in a little while. Concerning the Moabites, the land occupied by them was on the plateau directly east of the Dead Sea, primarily its southern half. It was characterized by nomadic herdsmen and small agrarian or agricultural settlements with no large cities. It sat right on the King's Highway, which was an important north-south trade route, and it was settled in almost every period covered by the Old Testament. Now, Moab was the son of Lot, again, as we mentioned earlier, by way of his incestuous relationship with his oldest daughter. Thus, the Moabites and the Israelites are cousins. Lot was the nephew of Abraham, and the Bible frequently mentions contact between these two nations, Israel and Moab. After the Exodus from Egypt, Israel fought Sihon, king of the Amorites, who had seized control of Moab in Numbers. This battle took place in Numbers 21. And Eglon was a Moabite king in Judges chapter 3. And during the period pictured in Ruth, relations between these people seem to have been stable. Later, conflict again ensued at various times. A dramatic picture of that is seen in an inscription from a Moabite king by the name of Mesha, who spoke of conflict with the Israelite kings Omri and Ahab in the 9th century BC. And then there was Joram's conflict with Mesha as recorded in 2 Kings chapter 3. Now, the religion of the Moabites was similar to that of the Canaanites in its major practices. Its major god was Chemosh, but it also worshipped his wife Ashtar and Baal, among other gods. Many of Chemosh's attributes described by Mesha are very close to Jehovah's attributes in the Old Testament, indicating that similar religious sensibilities existed between the two. In other respects, however, they were very different, such as in the matters of polytheism and human sacrifice, as we see in 2 Kings chapter 3 and verse 27. Now, let's discuss then the laws of levirate marriage and redemption. Numerous laws and customs lie behind events in the book of Ruth. And in many cases, the author assumes that the reader knows them firsthand. He doesn't bother to explain them. Of these, the most often discussed is the institution of levirate marriage and the related laws of redemption. The law of levirate marriage is found in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10, where a widow's brother-in-law is obligated to marry her and father a son for her in order that his dead brother's name be allowed to continue. In Ruth, the transactions bringing together Ruth and Boaz, and the potential one between Ruth and the near kinsman in chapter 4, are seen to be of this type. Now, we should note, however, that these are not, strictly speaking, levirate marriages as discussed in Deuteronomy. For one thing, the relevant root of the Hebrew word in Deuteronomy is yavam, or yabam, to perform the duty of a brother-in-law. That's not even found in the book of Ruth in this sense. In Ruth, the institution appears to be broader. The word that is used is the word goel, and it means to redeem, to act as a kinsman. Second, in Ruth, there is no case of a brother actually marrying a widow. And there are 3 cases of widows portrayed in Ruth, so this certainly could have happened. The closest reference to a true levirate marriage is found in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 11, when Naomi bemoaned her lack of sons to marry Ruth and Orpah. The use of the term levirate marriage in connection with Ruth represents the extension of the concept beyond what the law actually stated. More properly, The relevant legislation in the Pentateuch involves the laws of redemption found in Leviticus 25. There, the root Hebrew word is goel, as in the book of Ruth. There, in Leviticus 25, people or property that had been lost through selling them slaves, the people selling themselves as slaves, or the property being sold outside the family. This type of thing could be recovered. That is, a slave could be bought back, or a property could be bought back by payment of a fee, usually by a relative or an owner. For example, the redemption of a slave is mentioned in Leviticus 25, 47 to 54. And the redemption of property is mentioned in Leviticus 25, 24 to 34. This redemption of land seems to be behind the reference in Ruth chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. However, marriage was not specifically a part of the law found in Leviticus, the law of redemption, whereas it seems clearly to have been assumed by Ruth and Boaz in chapters 3 and 4. Furthermore, the provision that Boaz mentioned in chapter 4 and verse 5, whereby the near kinsman, in buying a field belonging to Elimelech, also was obligated to marry Ruth, that is not found in the Pentateuch. These two are examples. These also are examples of extensions of the law that may, in fact, have been practiced, but of which we have no direct knowledge. Now let's discuss the theology of Ruth, the theology of the book of Ruth. The first thing that we want to notice is God's sovereignty and steadfastness. There are numerous ways in which God's sovereignty and steadfastness can be seen in the book. First, there is a special focus on God himself in the book, particularly by the characters. Of its 85 verses, there are only 85 verses in the book, 23 of them mention God. Of these, only 2 are the narrator's comments, that is, the one who is telling the account, in chapter 1 and verse 6 and chapter 4 and verse 13. The rest of the mentions, that is, 21 of the mentions of the name of God, or the uses of the name of God, are from the mouths of the main characters. The characters themselves are conscious that God sovereignly orders events, and they depend on him to do so. This focus on God emphasizes a second related point, namely that he is seen acting, or he is seen as acting continually throughout the book. The well-ordered direction and pace of the account assure us that things will indeed work out for the family of Elimelech, which is threatened with extinction, and God does provide for them in the end. God's steadfastness also can be seen in his loyalty to his people, in his refusal to abandon them, and in his rewarding their faithfulness to him. These qualities are mirrored in remarkable ways in many examples of steadfast loyalty among the human characters in the book, particularly Ruth and Boaz. The most relevant Hebrew term here is chesed, sometimes transliterated chesed, but it's usually translated as steadfast love, kindness, or mercy. It also has to do with the idea of covenant loyalty. In Ruth, the term occurs 3 times, translated as kindly or kindness. But as we have said, we should note that loyalty and commitment are very much bound up in this word, along with kindness. In God's case, these involve commitment to his covenant and with his people. Paradoxically, in a book in which the characters express such confidence in God, and in which we see events always working out for their good, we can also note another theological theme, that God's presence and guiding hand are more hidden than in many other biblical books. It is not that God is at all absent from the book, but that his role is a steady, quiet one. As noted above, the man or woman who is recording the account seems deliberately to show restraint in referring to God, doing so only twice. That is, the narrator himself or herself only refers to God twice, as we said. Again and again, crucial turns in the story, in the account, which easily could have been attributed to God, instead are attributed to human action or even chance. See, for example, the comments about happenstance, that something just happened to occur, in chapter 2 and verse 3. It says, as it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz. And then in chapter 3 and verse 18, then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens. Also, no special miracles are referred to outside of the two passing references at the book's beginning and end, chapter 1 and verse 6, chapter 4 and verse 13. Even the genealogy is missing any comment about God's giving David to Israel. So the lesson communicated by this is that God's hand is to be searched for in the everyday affairs of life, in the turns of fortune, so to speak, of God's faithful people. The story's characters certainly were aware of this. His presence is a continuous and faithful one, not merely of the dramatic. That is to say, God's providence can be seen throughout the story, throughout the account, because it is there. Now let's look at the theme, the theological theme of inclusiveness. The book of Ruth communicates powerfully that God's purposes are not limited to Israelites. Ruth stands with a group of other foreigners in the Old Testament, not only the ones that we have mentioned up to this point, but also Melchizedek, Naaman, and the Ninevites of the days of Jonah, who knew or embraced Israel's God. Ruth was one of four women that we've already talked about. Tamar, Rahab, Bathsheba, and Ruth are all foreigners included in the line of Jesus in Matthew 1. She illustrates the principle laid out in Genesis 12, verses 2 and 3, that people would be blessed through their contact with Abraham's descendants and their God. Another theological theme is the theology of the monarchy. The last word in the book is David. The genealogical concern with David, both in chapter 4, verse 17, and in 18 through 22 of chapter 4, shows the book's interest in this great king, and by extension, in the institution of the monarchy itself. A major concern is the threat of eradication of Elimelech's name, his lineage. Not only does the book show how his name was preserved, but it goes on to show how his name became part of that great lineage so important in later centuries. Conversely, the book also functions to show that God's choice of David had its roots much earlier than David's own time. As one commentator by the name of Loritz has asserted, his choice is not made in a moment. It has a long prehistory, and took place before the chosen one was formed in the womb of his mother. The mysterious workings of God in behalf of David began during the lives of his ancestors. Now, this emphasis on the monarchy, specifically the Davidic monarchy, is reinforced by the prominent place that Judah occupies in the book as well. Several patriarchal wives related to Judah in one way or another are mentioned in Ruth chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, as is his son Perez in chapter 4, verse 12 and verse 17, and even Judah himself is mentioned in chapter 4 and verse 12. Judah was the tribe from which the true monarchy was to come, according to Genesis 49, verses 8 through 12. We can even note that the book goes beyond Judah per se and emphasizes all the patriarchs by way of many allusions and customs. In this way, Ruth and Boaz, and ultimately David, are seen as standing in continuity with all of these people, to whom God had promised, among other things, kings from their line. Now let's get to the book of Ruth itself, the text, and introduce it in a short piece here. The consummate literary nature of the book of Ruth is often commented on. Here we want to present a very brief exposition of the book that especially focuses upon its literary qualities, specifically the flow of thought, the overall coherence, the thematic and plot developments, and the characterizations. First, in Ruth chapter 1, you see a godly family emptied. The story begins with a rapid overview of the family that Ruth married into. There was a tragic history. They were driven out of Bethlehem by the land's emptiness or famine, and they were driven to a neighboring country, Moab, one that usually was hostile to Israel. In rapid succession, the family patriarch Elimelech dies. His two sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, and then these sons died, leaving the wife and mother, Naomi, without any true family ties or anyone to support her. The return home is found in chapter 1, verses 6 through 22. Naomi decided to return home, drawn partly by reports of food in her homeland. Her daughter-in-laws would not let her go alone. Ruth persisted in clinging to her even when her sister-in-law did not. And she promised her loyalty to Naomi in a beautiful speech in verses 16 and 17. Despite this encouragement, the chapter ends with Naomi discouraged over her fate. She wanted to be called Mara instead of Naomi, which means bitter. Naomi means pleasant. She was acutely aware that God had emptied her life of its fullness. Verse 21. That's a telling comment at the end that sets the stage for hope and fullness to come. It was the beginning of the barley harvest. Verse 22. Food was now available again, and it was through events associated with this harvest that Naomi's family was to be saved. In chapter 2, Ruth and Boaz meet. Chapter 2 begins at the outset of the barley harvest and ends at the wheat harvest. That is, it ends at the conclusion of the wheat harvest. Ruth set out to gather in the fields of whomever would grant her favor. By quote-unquote chance, which we would call providence, she came to Boaz's field, and found favor there. The narrator had mentioned him in verse 1 as being related to Naomi through Elimelech. But Ruth and Naomi did not know where she would end up. This so-called coincidence is typical of the many signs in the book of God's unseen hand directing things, his providence working. The meeting between Boaz and Ruth unfolds in 3 stages. First, she went out to the field, verses 3 through 7, and Boaz noticed her when he arrived and inquired as to who she was. The foreman of Boaz's workers identified her, stating that she had requested permission to gather among the sheaves and that she had been waiting, literally standing, most of the day for permission. Her request was somewhat bold. Previously, verse 2, she had intended merely to glean among the standing ears of grain, but now her request was to do so among the piles or bundles of already harvested grain, a much more assertive request. Nevertheless, Boaz granted even this, verse 15. Second, the actual meeting occurs in verses 8 through 13. A key verse in this section is verse 10, which includes Ruth's words as she bowed at Boaz's feet. Now, structurally, it occurs almost exactly at the chapter's midpoint, and Ruth's comment about her being a foreigner, and yet Boaz's taking her in, evokes many images about the Israelites having been aliens and foreigners in Egypt, yet they were under God's care in that place. Boaz's response was a most gracious one, indicating an awareness of what Ruth had done already for her mother-in-law. Now, in the 3rd stage of the meeting, in verses 14 through 16, Boaz's words provided for her by inviting her in for a generous meal and by instructing his workers to be generous in allowing her to gather grain. The chapter closes, verses 17 through 23, with Ruth's report to Naomi. Naomi saw God's hand in Ruth's meeting of Boaz. Her confidence helps to set the stage for the important developments in chapter 3. In chapter 3, we find Ruth and Boaz getting engaged. And the next scene begins with and ends with references to rest. It opens in verses 1 through 5 with Naomi making plans for Ruth with regard to Boaz. Now, whether Ruth's suggestion of marriage in verse 9 went beyond what Naomi had instructed her is not clear. Nevertheless, Ruth did ask for Boaz's protection in a scene that hints of the sexual union that is to come later. She justified her request by appealing to Boaz's status as her close relative, her Goel, as we've already seen, representing some sort of an extension of the laws of the Goel that we noticed back in Leviticus 25. We should note that her request for Boaz's protection recalls an earlier scene. The phrase, spread the corner of your garment, chapter 3 and verse 9, is literally spread your wings in Hebrew, which recalls Boaz's words about God's protection in chapter 2 and verse 12, where he said, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. Thus, we see that God's protection of Ruth was to be accomplished through Boaz. Now, Boaz's response in verses 10 through 13 and 14 through 15 was a pleased and pleasing one. And Ruth and Naomi were assured that he would do all he could for her. The only complicating factor was the presence of a relative nearer to her than him. That is, there's another relative that is closer to Naomi and Ruth than Boaz is. And therefore he should have prior claim to acting as her redeemer. Thus, the stage is set for the climax of the account, and the scene ends with Naomi anticipating exactly that. This brings us to chapter 4, where we see a godly family filled. Remember, in chapter 1, the family was emptied, but now in chapter 4, they are filled. A new home is established in verses 1 through 10. The tension concerning whether Boaz will be able to marry Ruth is extended in the opening verses of the final scene as the legal groundwork is covered, establishing the legality of whatever was to come. The near relative was informed of a field that Naomi had for sale, and it offered an opportunity to him to buy it under the laws of redemption. He readily agreed. However, when he was informed that marriage to Ruth was part of the obligation, again referring to an understood Israelite law or a custom otherwise unknown in the Bible, he was reluctant to follow through with the situation, citing the risk to his own inheritance. Now, at least two issues are worthy of comment in this place. First, why did Naomi appear so destitute early in the book if she, in fact, had owned property such as this? Neither the book nor any known Israelite law or practice presents any answer. The property may have been taken over by someone when the family moved to Moab, depriving her of any benefits from it when the famine was over. Second, what occasioned the near relative's initial acceptance and subsequent change of mind in verses 4 through 6? Here also, there is no established law or custom to provide a clear answer. However, assuming that he did not know about Ruth initially, undoubtedly he saw an opportunity for an improvement in his own wealth. Even if he were obligated to care for Naomi, she was old, and the field would have been his when she died, presumably in the not-too-distant future. However, Ruth's presence suggested that she, or the son born to her by this man, would retain or regain rights to the land after Naomi's death. Thus, he would have endangered his own wealth by assuming the care and keeping of Ruth and any of her children, along with Naomi. So his answer was, in essence, we believe, I don't have the resources to do this. Now, the near relative's refusal to redeem the land and marry Ruth marks a climactic turning point in the account. The rest of the section flows from this refusal, emphasizing it further, verses 7 through 10. The next section also emphasizes it, since it shows the resolution of the issue of Elimelech's and Naomi's lineage by way of the son that was born to Ruth. Legally, Ruth and Boaz's son, Obed, perpetuated the line of Elimelech, and Naomi and Ruth's deceased husband, Mahlon. However, it also is clear that Boaz is reckoned as legally part of the lineage in question. Evidently, both assumptions were accurate and understood in that way at that time. Now, in verses 11 through 22, the last sections of the chapter reveal that the satisfying resolution to the crises introduced earlier went beyond merely showing God's hand in the life of one's family for its own sake. The townspeople blessed, and their blessing in verses 11 and 12, and the genealogies in verses 17 and 18 through 22 make clear that these events were part of the great family and great scheme of things that had begun in patriarchal days and stretched into the establishment of the Davidic monarchy. As such, the book forms an important prelude to the monarchy and its canonical place following the book of Judges, which also points to the monarchy. And this is most appropriate. Its focus on in the end upon David points the way to the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, in which David is the dominant figure, both historically and theologically. The book reminds us that God's care extended at the same time to one family and to the entire nation, and that nothing happens to people without God's eye upon them and his wings over them if they are faithful. Now, we've got some other things to say about the book of Ruth, but we're going to have to stop here, and we'll pick up with our last comments on Ruth in session 10, and then we will get into the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So, as I've always said, if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me. Thank you.